Thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate having so many folks on the line to talk today about college access and success, an issue that for PACE for many years has been top priority. We know now that we are all experiencing a very difficult time here in California, and you on the line today. School closures, both in early childhood, K-12, and higher education, have put a lot of pressure on our system and a lot of pressure on all of us as both educators and parents across the state who are now completely transforming the ways that we think about education in the short term and already starting to reckon with the long-term impacts. I know that we here at PACE, and I'm sure for many or all of you who are on the webinar today, we're very increasingly concerned about equity gaps that will likely emerge as a result of COVID-19 and the related economic and social crises. And we are becoming very tightly focused on how we can bring evidence to bear in helping to advance recovery efforts for California when students go back to school. Our students will be out of school for a long time, and we'll need to have very strong and aggressive approaches to helping to support them at reentry. And so what we're going to be talking here about today is a great example of the kinds of research that we're going to be advancing in the months ahead. It's very important to understand where we were before, and then also to be able to highlight what was working and what some of our best knowledge is about how to advance things that we know can be forces for positive change for our students and our educational institutions. So without any further ado, I would like to hand it off to Michal Kurlander, who is going to introduce the panel today, and then to launch us into the research. Thanks so much, Michal.
Thank you, Heather. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. I want to just first echo Heather's message of concern and really our commitment to direct our collective attention and research focus to how this crisis is challenging our students and families and our education institutions. And just to note that we've already begun efforts to understand how school districts and community colleges, for example, are responding and investigating students' differential access to curriculum and instruction, and what supports have moved online from financial aid to mental health. Of course, we're very much aware of the challenges of an all online environment and how the way that those challenges present for students, particularly who may already be struggling academically or financially. And also just want to note that I've personally been inspired daily by many examples of leadership and of just humanity demonstrated among our educators and education leaders, whether it be teachers or counselors or our community college presidents that are doing so much for our students right now. And just our priority at PACE and as researchers will be to continue to support these education institutions from K-12 to higher education. So today, I'm going to talk about our ongoing, now many-year collaboration between us researchers at UC Davis and the California Department of Education. I'm joined by my colleagues at UC Davis, along with our longtime partner at the Department of Ed, Jenny Singh, who will be able to reflect on some of what we've been doing. The end of our presentation today, our work has been broadly to investigate pathways between K-12 and higher education, thinking a lot about what college and career readiness means in California, what it means to our colleges, what it means for our high schools, and what it means to students. How do we measure it? What disparities we observe in many aspects of the pathway to college. Go ahead, you can please advance the slide. Thank you. This is just a picture to represent one of the ways we're thinking about this is just the pathway to college is long and has been started earlier and earlier. This is just one visual we have that we really like that thinks of as from one school district. This is from Long Beach College Promise. And we have been trying to understand the pathway to college from as early as elementary and middle school and into and through college today as we begin to look at college persistence and completion. A big focus of our work has been on equity and in particular, equity and opportunities for students by key subgroups that we tend to look at, students by socioeconomic disadvantage status, race, ethnicity, and in some cases, other important subgroups like English learners. Thank you. Today, we're going to focus on 3 aspects of our research. First, we're going to set the stage by actually talking about a report that we released a little over a year ago, but that has important relevance for how we think about what we're doing with that data today. So we're going to talk about a study that we did to evaluate or to just map out where California high school students enroll in college. And we're also going to talk about a report recently released that are looking at district efforts to improve and support students' college readiness. We're going to look at statewide data from our college career readiness indicator and evaluate the extent to which we see students are ready by different metrics on that indicator, as well as qualitative work we've done with school districts to understand how inside their school districts, in what ways they're supporting students in their college readiness efforts. And finally, we're going to give you a sneak peek at new work we're doing to look at college persistence and completion. And that is new work that we'll be releasing in the coming months. So just to set the stage, I want to talk about this report that we released just slightly over a year ago. All of our reports that we're going to be talking about today are available through the PACE website. You can use the chat where we will, if you are having a hard time finding the link, we'll also again paste the link for you. Importantly, this is work this report that looks at where California high school students attend college is work that we did for 3 cohorts of California high school students, where we matched high school students to National Student Clearinghouse data. This is for the seniors of 2014, 15, and 16. And we tracked them into college through this match we did with the National Student Clearinghouse. This is again was in partnership with the California Department of Education. And the reason we're bringing it up again here today is for folks who aren't aware that data is now available at the school level through the California Department of Education. And we indicate the link for data requests that where you can retrieve that data and look at college participation and enrollment by segment and by high school through the California Department of Ed's website. Just a couple patterns that we want to highlight before we get into the new work. Again, the beauty of being able to look at an entire census, a cohort of California students. In this case, we look at 3. We give all students some opportunity to sort of delay college start when we look at their college enrollment up to several years following high school. And in this slice that we're showing you here, and there are many more slices that we provide in the report, we're looking at what % of students enroll in college within 1.5 years of completing high school, if they completed a normative time. And we know that 63% of students enroll in college among, again, the high school graduating cohort or completing cohort. 27% go to 4-year college, 36% go to 2-year colleges, 37% actually don't start college at all. Among those who do go to college, this is the breakdown for what types of colleges they enroll in. So among the 63% of high school students who do enroll in college, 57% of them enroll at California community colleges, 18% at Cal State University campuses, 11% go out of state, 10% are at the University of California, and 4% attend private or in-state 2-year or 4-year colleges. The report demonstrates a variety of differential participation rates. Here, we're just showing you how enrollment varies by race, ethnicity. Important again, here, the denominator here is among all high school students. And so if you look at across the bars, you'll see differential participation overall by these key racial ethnic groups: Asian Pacific Islander, Black, African American, and Latinx students, and white students. And importantly, we can also see differential participation by segments, right? That is, we can see more and less participation, for example, in our 4-year institutions, UC and CSU. Finally, here I'm just going to show that in college enrollment also varies across counties. So here we have the density with which participation by region, by California region. In the report itself, we actually provide those enrollment participation rates at the county level. And so I encourage you to look at the report itself to identify also the county-specific enrollment rates. I'm going to now turn to my colleague, Alex Hurt, graduate student at UC Davis, to talk about work we have done to look at what statewide indicators of college and career readiness have been, along with, matched with qualitative interview data that we did with school districts across the state to understand what tools they're using and what metrics they use to better support their students in their pathway to college.
Thank you so much, McCall. Good morning. So beyond college enrollment, what does readiness for its academic demands actually look like? So in this report, we're highlighting this in two ways. One, we consider college readiness in California based on state level indicators, and we're also exploring how districts are supporting students in their preparation for college. Oh, could you please advance the slide? So these are really our two main questions that we're focusing on in this report. Oh, could you advance the slide, please? Thank you. So data for this report comes from several sources. For state indicators of readiness, we're relying on two samples of student level data for students that graduated in 2018. And these are coming from the CASP and CCI, which together are providing assessment and course completion information, as well as demographics. Both of these data sets in this case are including mostly the same students, except the sample that's coming from the CCI is a little bit larger, as it's including students that may not have taken the SBAC in 2017. At the district level, we really focused on qualitative data. So this is coming from focus groups and audio and video interviews that we conducted with 20 school and district leaders across the state of California. And these leaders included superintendents, deputy superintendents, as well as other district level personnel that were really familiar with college and career readiness initiatives at that level. As we considered this data, 5 themes really emerged. 1, how college and career readiness was being defined, the indicators that were being used to measure it, the role of coursework in improving students' college preparation, and ways to further support students' readiness, as well as ways to monitor it over time. So in the report, we consider what college readiness means, given that research has yet to settle on one core definition. But in our discussions with district leaders, it was clear that career readiness was inherently tied to college readiness. So one district leader voiced it as, we're finding that even in our local industry partnerships, the students need the same level of education and skill, even if they're planning to go straight into the work field or some vocational training, they need that same level of high rigor. A district leader in Northern California also made a distinction between college readiness and college eligibility, suggesting that the skills students need to be successful in college do not necessarily align with those required for college enrollment. This idea of college and career, however, is reflected in one of the indicators used by the state. Part of the California School Dashboard, the College Career Readiness Indicator is a school accountability measure that classifies graduates as prepared or approaching prepared based on 8 pathways. And these include assessments as well as coursework, highlighting both college preparatory courses such as the A to G requirements, as well as career preparation, including CTE courses and leadership and military science. The CCI is only one indicator, but it also serves to highlight that overall multiple measures are being used at the state and district level, such as course and assessment performance, college admissions exams like the SAT, as well as students' enrollment and persistence in college. However, each of these indicators also suggests that there are different levels of preparedness for students and great variations between students based on race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and English learner status. One example of this is in the CCI itself. So in this figure, we'll see that the blue bars are students that are prepared and yellow are students that are approaching prepared. And out of all students that graduated public high schools in California in 2018, we're seeing that less than 60% of students were prepared or approaching prepared. And here we also see these differences across subgroups, particularly in terms of those prepared. English learners were only 15% of which were prepared, compared with 34% of students that were socioeconomically disadvantaged. And there's also large disproportion between Asian American students and white students that were compared to African American and Latinx students. How students perform on the Smarter Balanced State Assessment is also a key indicator given its use in the CCI, as well as its ties to the Early Assessment Program, which communicates whether or not students are ready for college based on their scores. Here, gray represents students that are not meeting either standard in either subject, with blue being students that are meeting both of the standards. And overall, we're seeing less than 1/3, so 31% of students are meeting both of these standards. And how students perform by subgroup is also similar to their overall preparedness that we saw on the CCI, as we see that there are certain groups that are meeting the standards at higher rates than others. We also spoke with district leaders about 4 main types of college and career coursework and its roles. Could you advance the slide, please? Thank you. So one is A to G courses, which students must successfully complete the requirements of in order to be eligible to enroll in a UC or a CSU. So in 2018, 40% of students completed A to G, with similar disparities appearing when we consider student subgroups, with Asian students participating at much higher rates than their peers, reflecting previous findings that we're seeing in both the SBAC as well as the CCI overall. And when we think about AP courses and exams, only about 14% of all students completed this as a pathway outlined by the CCI. In this case, these figures are representing exam participation, which was disproportionate across all subgroups, a similar pattern as we've been seeing. And when we talked about AP courses, one district leader said, "I've actually seen students receive the most opportunity for college access by the scores on their AP exams. It seems to me like it's the perfect mixture between rigorous coursework on a regular basis, followed with that demonstration of their ability in a formal assessment format." So given its ties to these indicators and college eligibility, access to these courses is particularly paramount for students. In terms of college credit courses through dual enrollment, which is usually part of a partnership with a local community college, research from our colleagues at Wheelhouse note that there are large differences in access to these courses, given that only 12.6% of California high schoolers take these courses, and a large majority of high schools in the state have no students enrolled in community college courses. This was reflected in our discussions with district leaders who said that this can be a challenge. Additionally, only about 8% of California high school graduates in 2018 completed CTE or career technical education or the career technical education pathway. However, it remains an important pathway for students in general, as noted by district leaders. Across California, we also talked to lots of districts that were implementing and adapting innovative strategies to support students in developing and monitoring their readiness. So these included starting early, blending in test preparation, and increasing access to it for students, particularly in the PSAT, as well as highlighting the importance of both counselors and the community in these efforts. So today, there are significant state and local efforts that are aiming to address college preparation and smooth the transition from high school to college. Given the depth of this report, I was only able to touch on a few of our important findings. So I really encourage all interested to access this on the PACE website. I'll now turn things over to Kramer, who is going to talk about some of the new work our lab is conducting on college persistence and completion.
Thank you, Alex. We have started to do some new research. So far, you've heard from us some information about college and career readiness. We also referred to our previous report on enrollment. But here, I'm going to focus on what happens to students once they enroll in college. So, next slide, please. We use data from a couple of different places. As McCall mentioned earlier, we have a partnership with the California Department of Education, which has allowed us to get some NSC data. And we look at 11th graders who took the CST in 2009, 2010, and 2011, and use these sort of to approximate who would be 12th graders 1 year later and presumably graduate from college. We then are able to match that to National Clearinghouse data, which has information about what happens to students when they're in college from 2010 to 2018. And in the end, this allows us to create 3 cohorts of high school students and follow them and what happens to them in college for a total of 6 years. Okay, next slide. So here, just to start, we can see what happens to high school graduates or presumable high school graduates who participate in college. And one of the interesting things to notice is that, excuse me, my co-researcher wants to get in on this one. Let me get her out. There we go. One of the things to notice is that sort of between 1 and 7 semesters of college is certainly something people do. It's pretty uniform. And then there's this big spike of people attending college for 8 semesters, as well as 10 and 12 semesters. These 8 sort of 10 and 12 semesters are sort of more typical BA trajectories. So we're sort of seeing things that would be consistent with there being more people taking, attending college in ways that would allow them to get a BA and, at those bars on the graph. Okay, next slide. However, not necessarily surprisingly, but unfortunately, how these patterns play out amongst racial and ethnic subgroups is not uniform. If you look at the top left graph, that's for Asian and Pacific Islanders. The bottom right graph is for white students. And you can see these, the bars at 8, 10, and 12 semesters are, they pop out, they're relatively high in comparison to the other bars. Unfortunately, you don't see that for either the Black and African-American students or the Latinx students, indicating that, Asian, Pacific Islander and white students are participating in college in ways that is more consistent with getting a BA than Black or Latinx students are. And one of the important things about this, and that what we want to look at in future research, is that it indicates that there are not just disparities about kids reaching college, that even once a student reaches college, there are further disparities that impact the student. So you can't just sort of think about, okay, we're going to just get the kids to college and then, everything's going to be okay. You have to both, in order to really shrink disparities, you have to both think about getting people to college and then supporting them when they're in college. Next slide. Cool. This again, this is another way to slice the data. This is looking at both non-socioeconomic disadvantaged students and socioeconomic disadvantaged students. We can see again that there are comparatively a whole lot more non-SED students on enrollment trajectories that look like they're consistent with BA attainment than, unfortunately, SED students. So here we actually are able to directly look at who obtains degrees, and we're able to look at both BAs and AAs. One thing to understand about this graph is that if in the data, if someone received both a bachelor's and associates, we put them in the bachelor's pool. So these are mutually exclusive categories. In general, you can sort of see that about 45% of California high school students who participate in college obtain some sort of degree. But again, this isn't distributed equally around through racial and ethnic subgroups. Asian and Pacific Islanders and whites are, again, much more likely to obtain degrees than Black, African American, and Latinx students. Next slide. And these disparities are also seen across socioeconomic status as well. Non-SED students are much more likely to obtain some sort of degree than SED students. Okay, and then the last thing we wanted to look at was what happens to students who don't obtain a degree. of any sort. So here we constrained our sample to high school graduates who participate in college in the first sort of what you might think of as 3 semesters after graduating from high school, but don't actually obtain a BA within 6 years. So, you know, there's a lot of theories about what those students might look like in terms of how they participate in college. One thing before looking at the data, one thought that I had is there could be a lot of students who like maybe go for a semester and then drop out and go for another semester, maybe 2 semesters, and then drop out for, you know, a couple semesters and then go back and forth like this. And that might be a pretty typical enrollment pattern. That's actually not what we see. Instead, what we see is that the majority of students who don't obtain degrees attend college for some consistent period of time. So over 50% in general attend just college straight through until they drop out. So whether or not they attend for 1 semester in a row or, you know, 10 semesters in a row, they keep attending college and then they stop. And then there's sort of 2 other variants on that we look at, where you attend college consistently, but maybe you take 1 semester off, or you attend college consistently, but you take a year off, and then you just go until you stop. And that's what the vast majority of students who don't get a BA are doing in college. And it's compared to especially some of the other things we looked at, it is relatively consistent across both racial and ethnic groups, which you can see here, and socioeconomic status, which you can see here. Next slide. So I probably should have said like 15 times at the beginning, this is all very preliminary research. It is you know, a sneak peek of a report we're going to be putting out hopefully relatively soon, but we have you know, a number of more things that we need to look at. We're certainly going to be looking at more outcomes in the future. You know, stuff like multi-institutional attendance, majors look by region, and any other subgroups we can think of. But for now, at least, you guys got to see the first release of what I think is some very interesting results. Thank you.
Thank you, Kramer. Jenny, we're going to turn it over to you. Jenny Singh from the California Department of Education.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank all my colleagues at UC Davis for all the work that they're doing. We actually started working on developing a college and career measure in 2014. And I turned to Nicole several times to help with those efforts there. So, and I'm thrilled about all the work that they're doing regarding the CCI and all the efforts we're making at the department to expand on the CCI. So they asked me to provide some observations about the CCI and where we're headed for the Department of Education. So as I mentioned before, we actually started working on the CCI in 2014. With the passage of ESSA, we now have about 3/4 of the states who now have a college and career readiness indicator in their accountability system. And I will say we all probably, well, I know for sure that we all have different definitions of what it means to be college and career ready. We also have the recent reauthorization of Perkins, which really does provide a strong focus on students being college and career ready. So there is not only interest in California to try to focus on getting students prepared for success after high school, but there is a focus nationwide on this. So I think it's really important to realize that when we are looking at the CCI, we are looking at multiple ways that schools can demonstrate that their students are prepared to be successful when they leave high school. And the original intent of the CCI was really our desire was to put something out there that would help schools and districts rethink their high school curriculum for students, and hopefully close the gap between those students who are traditionally underperforming compared to those students who are traditionally high performing. So that was the original intent of the CCI. If anyone ever listens to the State Board of Education, when we were talking about the CCI, Sue Burr would often reference the CCI as something like the good housekeeping seal of approval. And so there was a lot of support from the State Board on implementing the CCI. But as you can see from the data that was displayed here today, California really does have a lot of work ahead of us in order to make sure that all of our students are prepared for success after high school. So currently, there are only about 44% of our students who are considered prepared on the CCI. And of course, just like all the data that was shown here today, there's a big difference between various student groups. So Asian and white student groups are performing much better and are being considered prepared based on the CCI compared to English learners, especially compared to foster students and students with disabilities. Foster students, only 13% are prepared. Student with disabilities, only 11%. So there is a huge gap that we have among our student groups that needs to be closed. You also saw that the students in 8 or more semesters, that was the, you see that those students who are enrolled for 8 semesters or more align pretty much with the CCI on considering who's really prepared. So I think I also want to address some of the things that I see that's happening in California regarding preparing students for success after high school. You know, I have a couple of different work groups that have been helping me with trying to get new indicators into the CCI. You know, now it is currently have a lot of college indicators and very few career indicators. So I have a CCI work group and an alternative schools task force that have been assisting with trying to determine which career measures we should be adding to the CCI. And we are of course, working with our CalPADS people to collect that data. But I think it's really important. I want to point out that the conversations that we're having with our CCI work group and our alternative schools task force has changed substantially over the last year. So when we first started talking about career measures, there was a desire to collect a lot of different things. But now when we're talking about should we put these new career measures into the CCI, the conversations changed quite a bit. So our CCI people have really stressed that they are working really hard in their districts to other students are prepared, and they do not want to water down the CCI. Sure that the focus maintains that all students, regardless of who they are and regardless of which programs they participate in, should have an opportunity to be prepared. There was a big example of how one district is really focusing on their students with disabilities and getting them into career pathways and completing the career pathways, because they think that is a really important piece of it's very important for these students to participate in these pathways. And of course, as you know, if you participate in the CTE pathway, you can only be prepared if you complete the pathway and do something else, like complete A through G. So the conversations among our task force members and our work groups has changed substantially over the past year, really focusing more on rigor. I have been doing a lot of presentations out in the field. We we keep track of all the presentations that we do, so we can give that to the board. You'll see that in all our board items. But you know, every 2 months, I think we have contact with about at least 2,000 people who are participating in our webinars or who are attending some of our presentations. And what I've learned from them when we talk about the implementation of the CCI is that a lot of districts are putting systems in place so they can track students to make sure that they're on track to completing things like A through G or completing their CTE pathways. They're really trying to figure out ways of having students get greater access to college courses. Right now, a very small percentage of students really have this. Really hard community colleges so that more students can have access. They're thinking about distance learning. They're putting a lot of things in place to give that access. They're really trying to expand those students who are taking AP courses. And of course, that means providing a lot of extra support to students who may need it in order to be successful in those courses. There is also an effort to increase the types of courses that are being offered in alternative schools. Normally, alternative schools would not offer things like CTE pathway completion, especially in the juvenile court schools. But there is a bigger effort to try to get more of these courses into alternative schools so those students can be prepared as well. And I think a lot of comprehensive high schools are really trying to help students at the comprehensive high schools to do credit recovery. We see more and more comprehensive high schools doing credit recovery instead of sending their students to alternative schools. So I think that is another area where there is a greater focus on making sure that all students are going to be successful when they complete high school. Hopefully over the coming years to come, we'll see more and more students who are prepared to be successful when they leave high school. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator.
Thank you. Heather, would you like me to take some of the questions?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. I was muted there for a second. So all of our panelists, we'd like for you to get back on video and we're gonna stop sharing the slides. We have a lot of questions in both the chat box and the Q&A box. So for anyone who'd like to add more questions, please put them into the Q&A instead of the chat. That way it's easier to keep track of, and some of them might be answered in text rather than live. So the first question that I'd like to pose to all of our panelists is a speculative question, but I'd like for you to speculate. We have a number of questions coming through just to ask about what we think might happen as a result of COVID-19 and students both having been out of school in K-12 and in higher ed at this time, and how it might change access and also enrollment patterns. So I know none of us has a magic ball, but I also know that everyone on this call has probably been thinking about these issues. So what are some of the considerations that are swirling for you as you think about that?
So, I mean, I think some of this has been in the chat as well. I think what's fair is that the most fair speculation is that we don't know, because we've never seen anything of this magnitude. We have had prior economic recessions, and we have had Katrina, and my colleague at Missouri Odette Grants was starting to look at some of this to get some hint. I think, again, the scale is very different. We do expect that students who, when we're thinking about college enrollment, that students who are already potentially more more vulnerable in some way. They're working. Their main concern right now is, beyond keeping their families safe, is also feeding their families, having a job. That school may play a less important role. We also believe, for that reason, that the community colleges, our primary open access institutions, are going to, as a principle, try to remain as flexible as possible for those kinds of students experiencing those challenges. On the broader equity question, I think we're seeing this as across the state, school districts are responding and some more quickly than others in getting technology into the hands of students, depending on the sort of technology capabilities, even in their own home communities. Their ability to even interact with that technology is going to be variable, and that's to your early comments, Heather, and mine, is why we want to get a handle on that to better understand. I think the fact that this is all going to take longer than we initially expected means more school districts are in fact trying to figure this out in the coming weeks. And so I hope that the loss or the gaps aren't going to be as great because everyone will be sort of having to get creative on this. My own colleagues here at Davis are trying to put counseling online. Again, our ability to access services beyond just content and curriculum, especially for things like the decision to go to college. Some colleges have provided financial aid information at this point for students to make decisions about admissions next year, while other colleges have been stalled in providing financial aid information for students. So students are very much hampered in already in unsettling times to make decisions. And for that reason, we do believe that that the open access institutions like community colleges may get some of those four-year students. That was one of the questions in the chat. Would we expect some exit from four-year to two-year? I think that the impending economic crisis alone might suggest that happens, but also students' overall insecurity, financial and otherwise, might be another reason. Should I go to another question, Heather, or does anybody else? Jenny, do you want to?
Sure. The Department of Education has been working very closely with districts to try to help to provide some guidance on how to move forward with the COVID-19. We do know that there are districts that are working very closely with partnerships with places like public TV or those companies that provide internet service. So I know there is one district that has actually reached an agreement with someone who provides internet service so that all their students could have access to online learning by getting free internet service. We have some districts that are working with public television so that they can put their classes on the public television station so that all students could have access to it. So as McCall mentioned, it has been a little bit of a struggle. There are some districts that are been able to get up running faster than other districts, but I think everyone is doing their best to make sure that they could provide online learning or some type of learning to students while they are at home.
Great, thank you both so much. So another question, I'm kind of going to do some popcorn to get our highest voted questions answered. So for those of you that are in the chat box, if you thumbs up a question, it raises it to the top. So there's a lot of interest in understanding the transfer from two-year community colleges to four-year colleges. What do we know about transfer rates? How have they been changing over time? And what's the variation look like? And how does transfer ultimately result in BA attainment?
So we, in the newer work we're doing on persistence and completion, we're going to look at transfer more closely. From prior work I and others have done, we're trying very much to understand transfer rates. We know that, and by that I mean we're trying to go beyond just existing understanding of who transfers and disparities we see in transfer, but also to look very closely at the state's efforts for increasing articulation and for improving transfer rates, for example, through like the associate degrees for transfer. I and colleagues at UC Davis and at UC Irvine, Betsy Friedman and Rachel Baker are doing work closely to understand the ADT in California, which could really be a game changer for students in that it actually does improve articulation between what students are taking at community colleges and once they get at CSU. UCs have also tried to improve transfer pathways for students. And so the goal here is to understand historically who transfers was a relatively small number in terms of the overall denominator of community college participants. But of course, that's because many community college students enter community colleges for different purposes, and many are for trying to get retooled, and many are taking a small number of classes to improve a current job or to relearn a new trade. And so when you think about the transfer rates, it's really important to think about the overall denominator of who you're thinking about. In general, if we think about first-year students who are taking some close to full-time or at least continuous enrollment, we know among those students, less than a third actually transfer to four-year. About 70%, or slightly more than 70%, those who do transfer to CSUs ultimately complete, and that number is actually increasing. We do see disparities in those, and to one of the questions in the chat box, we see disparities not just by individual characteristics, but also by campuses, and we're very much in efforts to understand what campuses are doing to improve transfer rates. I just want to alert people to an affiliated center to PACE and to UC Davis, which is Wheelhouse, the Center for Community College Leadership and Research, also part of UC Davis, where a lot of our community college focused work is also displayed. So I encourage you to check that out, and we'll get the website posted.
Great, thank you. So another question for the panelists is looking into work that I know McCall and your team are currently working on, but the understanding persistence degree attainment is something that many of our listeners are really interested in digging into, and I know that this work is still in progress, but is there any morsels that you can give folks about understanding predictiveness of standardized tests, A through G completion in terms of college degree attainment, so not just enrolling, but attainment, and anything we can learn about variation in degree attainment across universities?
Can I take this one, McCall?
Yeah, I was about to say, Kramer, you should take this one.
So unfortunately at the moment, we haven't been able to look specifically at A through G completion just due to data constraints. But we have been able to look at standardized tests here, specifically SAT scores and SBAC scores and GPA. And what we find is that they are all basically the same at predicting, well, they're all basically the same at predicting first-year outcomes. And then because the SBAC hasn't been around all that long, you can't look at long-term outcomes, but they're all basically, but SAT and GPA are all basically the same at predicting long-term outcomes as well. It would be really interesting to look at A through G completion, just given the state of the data at the moment, we haven't been able to do that. Another thing that we have looked at is sort of when you look at just using GPA, if you add SAT scores to your predictive models, how well does that improve your models? And the answer is not a lot. It's the same the other way around. If you start with SAT scores and you add grades to a model to help improve your predictions, you basically have an almost negligible improvement in your ability to make good predictions. So I think there's a follow-up about that. Has that been disaggregated by higher ed system? For short-term outcomes, we've been able to look at both UC and CSU systems, and there are slight differences. SAT scores are slightly more predictive at the UCs than they are at the CSUs, but it is a very, very small difference. Unfortunately, for long-term outcomes, we haven't been able to, just because of, again, data constraints, look at UC systems. But everything, the CSUs sort of their short-term how things work in the short term plays out in the long term as well. There's not sort of some sort of reverse pattern that might be unexpected. So I would guess, though I haven't actually been able to do it, I would expect the sort of long-term outcomes of the UCs to be the same as, you know, as you would see, they would be reflective of their short-term outcomes, and that you wouldn't see a very large difference.
Great.
So the report will feature some questions, Heather, have been about sort of multi-institutional attendance patterns and time to degree. And that's the biggest reason we're going back a few cohorts, is we do really want to, we know there's a lot of college enrollment participation. I mean, California actually has very high overall just participation rates, but now we're really trying to understand, do those participation rates really yield degrees, and what types of degrees, and how long it takes students to get those degrees. And the reason we need to go back a few cohorts, because we're going to give people several years to really be in the post-secondary system, with some stopping out, as Kramer was alluding to, and with multi-institutional attendance. We know that doesn't always just 2-year, 4-year. Some students move between institutions, and we're going to try to understand the full landscape of what that looks like in California.
That'll be great. And while we're on the topic of persistence and completion, we have a number of questions about how this data will ultimately be shared. Are there plans to put the school by school data on DataQuest like the college going data is now?
Yes, I think so. I don't know if my colleague Sherry Reed is also on the line. She can talk about it. But yes, one of the great things about our partnership with the Department of Ed is that we went into this together with the goal of providing also more data to the public and to school systems about how their students, and just a huge thank you to College Futures Foundation, which has funded this effort, among other sources. And that is precisely to do what you're describing, Heather, which is to make sure high schools, one of the things we heard over and over again in the report that Alex presented is that college participation isn't enough. And that really high schools, what they want to know is how their students are doing once they get to college. Do they persist? And ultimately, to some other question we saw, and do they get degrees? They know that that's the ticket to protect yourself from unemployment and to be in the middle class. And so they're really trying to get their students to understand it's not just college entry, it's college completion. And now high school districts will be able to assess the completion patterns for their students.
Do we know what the timeline will be for having that data publicly available?
I don't think
when it's done.
I think we're working on it. We have meetings on it. We're going just as strong,
right.
including meetings already this week and next week. So Jenny and her team and folks at the Department of Ed that we work with, and really led by Sherry Reed, my colleague, we're moving as quickly as we can.
That's great. And it's, I think for all of our listeners understand that exploring new data is a journey. And so there's lots of decisions that have to be made about how that's reported and analyzed. So question from the audience about the research, both on college access, what our districts are doing, and persistence, so the full set. How does California compare to other states in terms of how we're doing on all of those dimensions?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the answer is, you know, again, on college participation, we have a big open access system, right? And so I think we have a lot of our students, again, by comparison to many states, participating in post-secondary schooling. On completion, we don't necessarily fare, we're not the worst, but we don't necessarily fare. I've been a little bit since I've looked at it across the country. I will tell you that our 4-year system lags behind other states in 4-year completion, but not necessarily when you include 6-year completion. Despite our desire for 4-year institutions to be 4-year completion, we know that a normative time for students is often longer. As Kramer has shown, those peaks are not just at 8 semesters, for example. They kind of go into year 5 and 6. And when you do look at up to 5 and 6-year completion, you see that California, at least the Cal State University, looks similar. We know there's time to degree issues at UC as well. Suggest the PPIC, and in particular Jake Jackson at PPIC has also done work to look at this, and I encourage folks to look at graduation rates are steadily rising at CSU, and time to degree is also declining some. And again, the issue has been really in improving 4-year degree completion, which remains quite sluggish, but once we give students a little bit longer to finish, especially those who transfer, we see improvements in completion rates.
Mm-hmm. Great. So let's switch gears a bit, because we had a number of questions about counseling. So maybe, Jenny, this would be a good question for you. The role of counselors has been highlighted in the research as potentially important, but we know that that's often an area where schools don't have as much support as they might like in high schools. What are your thoughts on the role of counselors and how we could strengthen that in California?
Well, I think I'm going to defer to McCall on this. I haven't done the research on it. I have been to sites that offer some really good counseling services, and that has made a significant difference. But my experience with that is limited to just a few sites that I've been to. So McCall, do you have a little more information you can share?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the I think it's important to know that the research based on college access has really highlighted information barriers as a key element to not just going to college, but where students go to college. So information barriers, not just on financial aid, but on college selection, on navigating college, remains a really important barrier for students. And so in high schools that have, where students, this is particularly important for first generation college students who have to rely on their schools and their school counselors as their primary source of information about college, right? For non-first gen students, then their ability to get it from their peers or family members might be different. But for students who really rely on the schools and the counselors, the access to those counselors and to quality information is really important. And so a variety of experimental and non-experimental studies have been done to try to understand how if you improve information sources for students, you improve their college outcomes. And there's been some mixed evidence on it, but what we do know is that the information gaps are there, and they're there for everything from how you apply to how you select a college, access to financial aid. I will tell you from our work with school districts that they're very well aware of this, and they are improving as best they can with the limits of the counselor-student ratios that they experience. And many have turned to other kind of community-based organizations or other efforts to get more peer-based former graduates of their high schools are coming. So we learned a variety of approaches that districts are doing, including innovating things like making the FAFSA, the federal aid, the form for federal free financial aid, the FAFSA form for students to as seniors to be part of their high school graduation requirements, right? So that every student starts some of the processes that we know that trip some students up in navigating college.
Great. So in our very last question, we have just 3 minutes left. We have a number of questions about bright spots or places that are really that are beating the odds, doing a lot better than others for student groups that we care about in California or that are historically underserved. What are some of those really exciting practices that you've seen, and how can we think about spreading those?
Yeah, great question. So I think we as a project and as PACE will be putting out more of these bright spots because we do get lots of questions about them. We don't like to shame colleges, high schools, districts ever. We let other entities do that, but we do love to highlight the bright spots, and we do need to do more of that. We're working, for example, with EdTrust West and with other groups to look, for example, at bright spots on dual enrollment. I know the College Board is often working with school districts, and we interviewed many of those in our report that are making SAT and PSAT kind of universal part of their college and college pathway processes. And so there's everything on, if you think about all that material that Alex presented on CCI, I think Jenny would, there's many bright spots. I think even one of the questions is improvement on the CCI. The more that districts are aware of what's being measured as part of that CCI, the more we expect that they'll try to improve on those indicators. And so the interesting part of the CCI as a multi-dimensional kind of index is that there are different bright spots for different aspects. And so we know some school districts, for example, have really invested in dual enrollment. Others have invested more in making sure all their students are A to G eligible, in increasing access to AP courses, in serving students through SAT or PSAT. So depending on what metric you use, we have different bright spots. I think in the coming year, we will want to sort of focus on highlighting the promising practices of school districts that I think are using a variety of approach. I didn't mention enough career technical education. Some school districts are really heavily investing in making sure students have career technical education options. And so I think our goal will be not just to highlight one, but to highlight the fact that school districts have a kind of, and students therefore have a complex set of choices in their pathway to college, and how are school districts approaching those different variety of options.
Well, thank you so much, McCall, Kramer, Alexandria, and Jenny. We very much appreciate your time. To all of our panelists, thank you for your time today. I think that it's a great note to end it on, that as we look to recovery, we really are going to lean on the places that are already engaging in these promising practices. And so raising them up and highlighting their expertise and hopefully leveraging them as leaders in spreading those practices will be a huge priority for PACE, both in K-12 to higher ed transitions, but also more generally. So thank you all so much. Don't hesitate to reach out to PACE with any questions that you have, and we hope that you read these reports, as a lot of the answers to some of the questions that we weren't able to get to today really are in that rich documentation. So be well, everybody, stay safe, and we'll see you at a future webinar.